but that was the acreage that my grandfather and he too. He had a little chicken house, and put in actually had more pigeons than my mother did. So for as long as he was working, why that's what he and my grandmother had the squab farm.
But that was the edge of town at that time.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. There was no. Well, the town I think was probably about 1,200 people. I think Zanette could probably tell you more accurately than I can how many kids were in high school at the time we were in school, but I think our graduating classes were like 27 or 32 or something like that. You knew everybody in town. Everybody in town knew you. And
what would your kids do for recreation?
my kids?
No, you
Oh,
as
us.
a kid. You high school kids.
No, we went to football games, we went to basketball games. They had high school dances. We had a theater that had relatively first-run movies, I guess, for the time. I don't...
I guess every year there was the Mayfair.
Oh, yes, yeah.
What was the Mayfair like in the 20s and 30s?
You know, I can't remember, really. I don't know. You see, I lived in the country. The 20s and 30s, I would have been 9, 10, 11. When I was a little older, I can remember my dad had a Model T that he had cut down into a pickup truck that he used to haul eggs back and forth to town. And I can remember trying to keep that going in the May Day parade, but I think that was probably in the late 30s.
The Model T was in the parade?
Yeah.
I guess it was all decorated?
I presume. There were 4 or 5 girls. I can't even remember who was on it. But I know we had a jar of water. We had a jar, and the parade wound around kind of the same general area that it does now. A little more extensive parade area, I think. And if things slowed down, we hopped off into somebody's front yard and filled up the water jar so we could keep it from boiling, because it just didn't like this slow.
Yeah. Put it in the radiator, keep it cool.
Yeah.
My truck doesn't like that either. Slow driving.
Yeah. It just don't. I can't.
Now there was a big. There were horse races. Everybody talks about that. I guess there's still horse races.
Well. Vallejo got our horse races.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, when Vallejo got the county... See, we had pari-mutuel betting here during the Mayfair. In fact, when my 56-year-old daughter was 3 weeks old, my dad had a heart attack at the horse races. Very severe heart attack. And my mother was off at the pari-mutuel window collecting his bet. And when she got back, he'd been loaded in an ambulance, and we never could figure out why they brought him home. At any rate, they took him to the hospital the next day. But yes, that drew people. The horse races and the pari-mutuel betting, I think, really added to the number of people that came from out of town, per se. Then when Solana County, I believe I'm right in that information, that when they established the Solana County Fair in Vallejo, the state moved, or whoever moved the pari-mutuel betting and the racing to Vallejo, and so we didn't have it anymore.
Well, you mentioned the Model T. It was made into a truck. It makes me think about the roads. I wanted to ask about the roads.
Dirt.
Dirt.
They were dirt when I was a kid.
I guess they were mud in the winter. Yeah.
Oh boy, yeah. And I don't remember, I can't remember when they were paved, because actually I have to stop and really think about, I don't know that I remember. It'd be interesting to check with the county and see when these roads were paved.
check your memory.
Yeah, because I don't know. Must have been, I would guess, probably sometime in the late 20s. I don't know.
Well, the other thing is electricity out in these outside of town.
Yeah, well, I think the folks must have gotten electricity fairly soon. And I don't know whether it was available and the people that had owned the 14 acres or 15 acres just hadn't connected up. Because I know Mother, she complained, as I mentioned, the fleas that were on the acreage because it had been a small pig farm. She said it was very inconvenient to try to find a flea that was in your bed with a kerosene lantern at night, and but I don't recall when. I don't know when they got the electricity, but I think shortly after they moved out there in the early 20s. We also were fortunate on down the road to have natural gas at a very early time, because when natural gas came to Dixon, it came in Dixon Avenue. And
lucky for you.
so they had the house I grew up in burned down about 2 years ago, but it had a good-sized basement and a great big gas furnace in the basement, because as soon as the gas was available, they put it in.
Now, how about a telephone? Did you have a telephone?
Party line.
Party line.
5 parties.
With Annette Seifer's mother as the
yeah.
operator.
Carrie was the telephone operator. And
so party line must have been kind of fun.
well, yes. If my mother called her mother in town on a Sunday to see if she had any baking powder, and my grandmother said, "Oh gosh, Faye, no, I don't," then maybe, if you're lucky, 10 minutes later, one of the neighbors calls and said, "I have some baking powder." That happened. I can remember one time, I must have been late grammar school, and I have a cousin my age that lived with my grandmother, and we had both I'd gotten permission to go to the movies that night. Of course, going always involved somebody taking you to town. It wasn't like you could walk out the front door and walk at night. And so I couldn't wait to call my cousin and tell her that I could go to the show, and could she go too. Picked up the phone to call her, and the line was busy. And with youthful impatience, I guess I tried relatively frequently to see if the line was getting on towards showtime. And about the 5th time I picked up the phone to try and use it, and it was still busy, I guess I said, "Oh, shut up," and hung up the phone. And my father heard me, and needless to say, I did not go to the movies that night. But, yeah, it's a good life growing up.
Well, what about when you were real young? Now, you said you're born in 21.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was 1920 that Prohibition came in. I think it went out in 33. Do you
Well,
know
I know
anything about
my
that?
uncle always called his business Dawson's Cigar Store, I think.
Now, it was a bar, and then I guess in 20 it had to change? Or when did
That
it-
part I can't remember. I can remember, wasn't it the early 30s when Prohibition
Was
went
repealed.
out? And that's when, it was at about that time that Joe Dawson came from Southern California and brought out his brother Ben and Bill, I think. By that time, of course, when the Capitol Hotel burned, Uncle Bill moved across the street to where the opposite corner. What's that? A real estate office.
Right.
I think they're in the corner. It was in that building. And he was still there when my Uncle Joe came up and bought the business. And then I guess the building across the street where Dawson's is now became available. It had been a hardware store. It was Johnson's hardware store. And for whatever reason, I don't know, they were selling. At any rate, Joe bought the building, and the family owned it until my aunt passed away 3 or 4 years ago. He had retired from the business, I don't know, he'd sold his business 10, 15 years ago. But the name stayed the same. And Harvey, who has the restaurant in there now, had leased space from Joe for several years back. It got started being a restaurant too, back when the state required that you couldn't have a bar without a restaurant. And there are many stories about Dawson's, and back when we were a big sheep area, and I've heard say more sheep and cattle were bought and sold in Dawson's probably than any place else in the area. And my uncle did not like women being in there. Did not like that at all. But World War II changed all that, because nobody could leave town for any entertainment. The Legion Hall would have dances, I don't know how frequently, but people stayed in town for their entertainment, and when the dance had an intermission, they streamed down the street to either Dawson's or the Acme Club for their refreshments during intermission, and then would go back to the Legion Hall. And so with no opportunity really to control it, why, and I guess women's livers coming along, maybe even in those days, at any rate, and I know I grew up in there on the counter, because I don't suppose my dad ever went to town that he didn't, whichever corner it was, that he didn't stop to see his brothers. And before I started school, of course, Mother was teaching, and I went every place with my dad. But I had friends in school who had never been in there, nor, in fact, one very dear friend of mine who passed away a few years ago said her mother always said to her, if you have to walk down that side of the street, turn your head the other direction when you go by. So.
Well, how did your family and your uncles survive the Depression in the 30s?
I don't know about my uncles.
Well, how about your family?
My family.
You said the price of eggs went down.
Oh, yeah. I don't know whether they were severely in debt at that point in time. You never were hungry because you had plenty to eat.
Especially eggs.
We were visited by, we're about a mile and a half from the train tracks, either direction, and I remember a frequent stream of people coming by looking for, was there work they could do for food. Well, we didn't have that much work for them to do, but my mother always sent everybody off with a paper bag full of fried egg sandwiches. And I remember her teasing Dad, I don't know whether I mentioned that when this thing was on, that the chickens didn't make any money at 9 cents a dozen, but that she had not lost money on her squabs. And of course, they had, well, I don't know. We survived. I do remember that starting about the 7th or 8th grade, I needed a new winter coat, and it got postponed for 3 years. Now that would have been in the mid-30s, because I graduated from grammar school in 35. 7th grade, I really need a new winter coat. And my mother said, oh, wouldn't you rather have one when you're in the 8th grade? I'll make you a jacket this year, and we'll wait and we'll get the winter coat. Nothing was really ever said about well, what you heard on the radio and so forth. But then came 8th grade, and gee, I really do need a new winter coat. I really think you'd enjoy it much more if you have it next year when you're a freshman in high school. So I think it was 36 that I finally got my new winter coat, which I wore all through high school, but didn't, very, very, very fortunate that it was not something that, I remember there was an extra spending money, but certainly didn't suffer. If they were suffering and they didn't, my folks, I don't know if they ever had an argument or not, but if there were problems, you didn't hear about them. Very, very comfortable growing up. Feel very fortunate. And of course had this younger brother that came along 9 years later, so I wasn't the center of attention after that. But that was great too, because I think it kept my father young far beyond his years. John went off to Berkeley and played a little, not varsity, but what did they call the younger team?
Junior varsity.
Well, whatever.
Or whatever they call them.
Yeah. And Dad never missed a football game if they were in Berkeley. He'd go down there and climb those steps. I remember worrying about him, whether he should do that or not. But and when John was in high school, and they had Zanette's brother were in the same class. And they'll tell you a drop of a hat about their championship football team. So Dad would, he was semi-retired. He had men running the chicken ranch, and so he could go sit and watch all the football practices and everything. So those were good days.
You mentioned there grammar school. We haven't talked about grammar school. Now, you were out in the country, but you went into town for grammar school.
Yeah, Mother was able to get permission for me to go to town to school, since Tremont, which was our nearby country school, was further out in the country than where we lived. We were about a mile from town, and Tremont School was about 2.5 miles from town. So since she was going into school every day, why, they allowed that I could go to school. So I started kindergarten at a very early age, because that was convenient for my teaching mother. And I started, my birthday was in November, and I started in December, I think, to kindergarten. But when school was out in June, I couldn't go on to the first grade. I wasn't old enough. So that first kindergarten, the half year, was in the old grammar school. By the next year, they had purchased a little house right across the street from my grandmother's house to be used as a kindergarten. And Miss Kuntz came to teach. Miss Kuntz, who was later Mrs. Moss, and who hasn't been gone too long. Her husband just passed away last year. I forget. At any rate, and everybody dearly loved Miss Higgins. Miss Higgins had 3rd and 4th grades. Everybody worried about Miss Canupi, who was the 5th grade teacher. You learned a lot, but she was very strict. And it was great. It was nice for me too, that my grandmother lived right behind the school, so I had some place to hang my hat till time to go home with my mother. But it was small. Everybody knew everybody.
Well, everybody knew everybody, and I've been talking to a lot of people, and I'm always hearing about the groups. I don't know, I guess nowadays call them the ethnic groups, the Germans, and then there's the Portuguese and Italians. And
Yeah, we have a lot of, well, I think the early settlers here predominantly were German. You know, it's funny, I can't remember as I was growing up thinking anything about what ethnic background people were. I recall, I think we were conscious when I was in high school that there were a lot of Japanese kids in Vacaville, of course, because of the basketball teams and stuff, you know. And we didn't have, I don't think we had any Japanese here. It was many, many years, I think, before we had any African American people here, whether it was because it was an area where there was farming and not some other kind of employment. I don't know. But I don't remember. I know that most of the Portuguese people were involved with dairies, but you didn't think of them as being, I mean, it was something I never really thought about.
Other people have told me that too.
Yeah.
It didn't matter.
No.
But the Portuguese, no, they had their own parade, right? The Holy Ghost parade.
When they used to have the Holy Ghost celebration, yeah. I was in school with one fellow in particular whose father and uncles and stuff had been very active in
Now that wasn't Vernon Dutrow, was it?
Well, it was Vernon at the time he was growing up, he lived out past where I lived, and we were good friends. No, who I was thinking of was Al Bello. They started at one point to kind of revive the Holy Ghost celebration. There is a very active group now that Our Lady of Fatima, I think. Al said, well, there'd never be another good Holy Ghost celebration in town because all the good Portuguese were dead, he said. Meaning his father and his uncles and stuff that had worked on it. But, yeah, that was always, except now where my husband grew up in the town of Lincoln, and they had their celebration earlier in the year, I guess, because he was in the high school band in Lincoln and said they always marched in the parade for the Holy Ghost Festival. Well, we never did here, I don't think, because school was out, as far as I can recall.
Yeah, I think it was in June or July.
Yeah. So, I was just looking, my cousin lives down the road from me, my mother's brother's daughter, and she married years ago a fellow, he passed away last year, a fellow by the name of Herb Dutra, and his younger sister had been the little queen. In fact, she came down to a high school reunion last week that we were at, and she had some pictures. Somebody brought her some pictures that they'd taken of her when she'd been the little queen at the festival in town.
There was a little queen and a big queen?
Yeah.
Oh, I never heard about that.
So, a lot of us still kind of aren't too far away, or, of course, I've spent my whole life here outside of a year or two in Placerville and then another year or two in Sacramento. I always seem to get back to Dixon.
Well, now, what about doctors?
Dr. Stolley and Dr. Parsons.
Dr. Stolley and Dr. Parsons.
Trying to
wasn't Dr. Hall, but he died.
Oh, Dr. Hall, yeah, he was on,
He died
I
in
don't,
1935.
yeah, is that when it was?
I believe
I
so.
know, he was on the school board when my, I shouldn't be augmenting it. He was on the school board when, at the time my mother retired in 1930, although I don't think she'd announced it. Maybe she hadn't announced it. My brother and I were both born in November. And she used to laugh and say Dr. Hall had met her on the street and said, "Faye, I want you to tell me how it is you can manage to have these children and not miss a year of school," because of course nobody taught if they were obviously pregnant in those days. And she informed him she was not a math major for nothing. So but I cannot remember when Dr. Hall was a practicing doctor. MD. I never never thought about it. He was always retired as long as I could remember. Dr. Stolley, his daughter-in-law still lives in town. Francis, his son that was a little older than me, has been gone for several years. You find a lot of the people you remember best aren't around anymore, you know. So. But we had good care, I think.
Of course, doctors made house calls.
Oh yes, well they were still making house calls when my daughters are 55 and 56. So 50 years ago, I suppose, which seems like forever to you. Bobby, my youngest daughter, had pneumonia when she was about 4, and the doctor was making a house call when he announced that that's what she had, and he really thought she ought to be in the hospital. They were still making house calls then.
Yeah.
In fact, they're, I think sometimes doctors get a lot of publicity. I know my aunt's doctor here in town, when she spent the last 4 or 5 years of her life confined to her home, and her doctor was always very good to come to the house if they needed her, and that's been within the last 2 or 3 years. So they will still do it. Maybe they don't advertise it or don't do it on a routine basis, but if necessary, they will.
Well, who would you say were the, I guess you call them the leading citizens of Dawson back in
Dixon?
Back in the old days? I guess the Royers, a pretty important family. I think two of them were mayors, weren't they?
Hance was mayor, I think. And Claude, younger brother Claude, was city attorney. He passed away at a very relatively early age. Well, I think the Moss family, Mace family, Royer family, highly respected people.
The Moss family do. I'm not familiar with the Moss.
Mr. Moss worked in the bank. He was in what's now the Bank of America for years. When it was the Bank of Dixon,
Bank
I
of
think.
Dixon. Oh, I see.
And in later years, I think he looked after one of the feed warehouses, I think. He was kind of semi-retired when we used to, where we would get our grain supplies. His daughter-in-law, my kindergarten teacher, also was still,
Now, let's see. You
Mr.
said,
Moss's daughter-in-law, Romaine Moss, who was not that first half year, but my first full year kindergarten teacher, was still kindergarten teacher And I think second or third grade teacher when my girls were in school. And of course that happened to a lot of kids around here. The teachers like Miss Higgins or like Mrs. Moss, who stayed on for a number of years, they had a couple of generations of families. And I know Mrs. Moss told me one day that someone had brought her a birthday cake to school, and children, of course, were making a big thing out of it being her birthday and so forth. And she said, "Your youngest daughter stood there. I could see her," she said. "Mrs. Moss, there aren't enough candles on that cake. Didn't you teach my mother?" she said. So, at any rate, it was nice, kind of the continuity of things. So, I run out of things to talk about unless you can think of something else.
I can think
to
of a lot of
ask.
things to talk about. Something I forgot to ask you about before we turned on the tape was Zanette wasn't sure if you had something to do with the American Legion or the Women's
No.
Auxiliary.
No. My parents were very active
Oh, that must be-
American Legion and auxiliary members.
Of course, your
and-
father was a veteran.
Right, and that was, I think, a fair, back in those Depression days and stuff. I don't know just when the chapter was organized here, but I think that was a social thing as well as just an organization in those days. I think they did. They, of course, had built that hall there, and
That hall is still in town.
yeah, oh yeah, that's where we had my brother's class had their 50-year reunion there Saturday night,
Oh.
and it's right across from the city park. Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked to several people. I've noticed, well, what you said before, social.
Yeah, it was
organization.
it was probably the only